What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Clap Your Hands podcast, a true off-season edition of the Clap Your Hands podcast. We are in those dog days of summer, the dog days of the off-season, but as I always say, brought to you by Audacy Sports. Make sure you're downloading that Audacy app. Make sure you leave a 5-star review. Now's the time to do it. It's the off-season. You got time to burn. You're checking for updates. Leave those 5-star reviews. Brought to you, of course, by Sports Radio 94 WIP. And brought to you by an off-season version of Kyle Neubeck. Man, Kyle, we talked for like 10 minutes before the pod. Not a lot going on right now with the Sixers. They are really in a holding pattern as we just kind of sit and wait.
Yeah, off-season Kyle Neubeck, just excited to have his sectional finally in the house. That when we get done the pod, I can go and sit on a real couch and stretch out. And, it's just...
Is the house all put together now?
Hell no, man.
No.
There's still lots of stuff to do. But I will say, you only see what happens in this room.
I know. We only get to see this in the occasional Louis appearance. We're not seeing the rest of it.
But there's been a lot of baby steps, and we're getting there. So that's more than Sixers basketball. That's kind of my focus in mid-July.
Like when we moved into our house, we probably moved in, I don't know, maybe like 2.5 years ago at this point. I feel like it takes a full year when you move to truly feel like you have.
Don't tell me that, man.
I'm just trying to let you know. Like I think you got a little bit, but that aside, and hopefully before camp, and I'm thinking Eagles training camp, but I mean for you Sixers training camp. Hopefully before then you have your house all put together. You get some time to enjoy that nice sectional. We actually do have some stuff to talk about today, despite the fact James Harden is still on the roster, despite the fact Damian Lillard is still on the Blazers. We got some Nick Nurse updates. Nick Nurse doing a bit of a media tour in Las Vegas during the Summer League. He was on Tyrese Maxey's pod. He did some interviews on NBA radio. And one quote that I wanted to talk to you about today, let me pull it up right here. He was on NBA radio. And he said, I think that there's a lot of talk about what the roster looks like today, but I don't think that will be the same roster that hits training camp. So I go to you, Kyle, and ask, is this just coach speak? Is this just, Howie Roseman saying the roster's always in flux? Is this, or is this something where the roster we're looking at today, like Nick Nurse genuinely expects it to be a very different roster?
Well, so I think there's truth in both those things, right? Where I think there is an urging from the front office, people who really matter in the organization, saying the offseason's not over, right? It's mid-July. Mm-hmm. There's so much time between now. I know it doesn't feel that way, and 2 months is not an abundance of time, but in NBA terms, it certainly is. And we've talked about it 100 times. The Harden move is the big domino for everything else. If they trade Harden, they're going to have probably several new players, or those several players are going to get rerouted for a star player. And so even if it's, just swapping out James Harden for another big name, that in itself is a significant roster change. It's the biggest one you can make aside from trading Joel Embiid, which I think we would both agree is extremely unlikely to happen.
Yes.
So
at least this offseason.
I think this team, the message from within has been, we haven't done many big moves, or you could argue any big moves this offseason, but we still have until, there's not an exact date yet. We still have until like September 20th or 25th before we even see those guys regularly. And there'll be probably some pickup games toward the end of the summer before training camp, and these guys will get reacquainted in that way. But I don't think they really feel urgency. I shouldn't say that. They certainly feel urgency to improve the team, but they don't feel like they need to rush it, because making a deal just so it's settled in mid-July and they don't have to do anything the rest of the summer essentially is not how they're carrying themselves.
Well, it's interesting when you use the term urgency to an extent. I think you're right to say it's not that they don't feel urgency. I just think their path to urgency is feeling that the best path is waiting. Like, I don't think they're sitting up in there and not caring. They feel it's an urgent matter to figure out what's happening with Harden. But the best path, it seems they believe, is to hold on to him. And what I think is interesting about Nick Nurse's comment, and of course it ties into the James Harden thing, as you said, is we've talked about this James Harden thing for so many angles. What's Daryl want? What's Embiid think? What does James want? What's the trade package? All those things. We haven't really brought up the Nick Nurse aspect of this. And Nick Nurse, as a new head coach, just hired, just went through the interview process with Daryl. Like, I remember when the Eagles hired Nick Sirianni, Carson Wentz was still on the roster. And when he had his introductory press conference, I believe he was asked about it, or at least early on in his tenure. But I am sure that when they interviewed Nick Sirianni, they knew, like, okay, this is what's going to happen with Carson. We can talk about it internally, but this is what's going to happen. We saw this in Houston with Udoka, right? It seemed that the Houston wanted Harden. They were asking all their head coaches, and reportedly Udoka did not. So my question to you, and just like something to think about for the listeners, is like, what does Nick Nurse want? And what does Nick Nurse know? Like, do you think when Nick Nurse was in that meeting with Daryl Morey and they were deciding, interviewing each other about taking this job, like, do you think at that point Nick knew the outcome of what was going to happen with James Harden? Like, did he take this job thinking Harden's not going to be here? And that's why when you asked him at the press conference about Maxey being a facilitator, he talked about, like, yeah, Maxey has to get better as a facilitator. Or do you think he expects Harden to be on this roster? Because I think that's such a key part of all this. Like, what does the head coach want? Or what does he expect?
Well, so I think he probably came here preparing to potentially lose Harden, but it might not be for the reason that we're talking about right now, right? I think when Nurse was hired and they would have had those discussions, it seemed more credible that Harden might leave to go to Houston in free agency and sign somewhere.
Yeah.
And it was not going to be because the Sixers, under the guise of, hey, we tampered last season and can't do that this year. I don't want to pay penalties or anything else. And evidently irritated Harden's camp. I don't think Nick Nurse would have prepared for that. But does that matter? Is it any really functionally different for him? Not really. In fact, this is probably the superior route for him in many ways, because if Harden does leave, if he had left in free agency, you have little recourse to replace his production. At least now you can say, all right, if they trade him, he's probably getting multiple pieces back, multiple role players who will help the team and sort of help him establish the baseline and the culture that he wants to. So I think it ends up working out better for him. But no, I don't think he took the job expecting this exact scenario. But maybe you could argue, Harden is just kind of a unique guy and can be set off in various ways. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I would say I'm probably more like that than not, where that just get in weird moods and get pissed off by
Amen.
stupid things that I shouldn't, evidenced by how I handle myself on Twitter. So, or I guess Threads and everywhere else these days. So,
yes.
I don't know that this is something that he planned for specifically, but I think Nick Nurse is not a guy. If we talk about, his adaptability and his flexibility and so on and so forth, would he rather have the superior talent? Of course he would, but I don't think he would look at this situation and be like, man, this sucks. I'm screwed. The team's not going to be good. I think he probably looks at it as, all right, this is another problem that I have to try to solve. And, if I have this roster with James leading alongside Joel, here's the idea that I have. If I don't, then I'm going to have to be a little more adaptable, and we're going to really experiment. We're going to do X, Y, Z. And so I think that's probably more how he's thinking about this.
See, but to me, that seems like a bit of an issue, because to tie it back
For
to
sure.
to tie it back to the Eagles thing, like the offense Nick Sirianni and Shane Steichen were going to run their first year together with Carson Wentz would have been very different than the offense they ran with Jalen Hurts. And I understand it's a quarterback and there's differences there with NFL to NBA. But let's be honest, like Nick Nurse is preparing for his first year as head coach. The day one of training camp, he wants to go into that camp, that practice, like confident in what he wants to do, send a clear message as to what the team's plan is. And between now and then, and in training camp, from training camp to day one or however long, like he needs to implement his system, what he wants to do. Tyrese Maxey had an interesting quote talking to him to Nick Nurse, saying that he really respects that from going against Nick Nurse, like what he tries in practices and stuff, like, or in games, he implemented in the playoffs and those type of things. Nick Nurse likes to have
There's a big hit to the pro Doc Rivers contingent on
I
this
know that
podcast.
was tough to see. Doc's been taking some strays from people this offseason for sure. But Nick Nurse has a system he's going to want to implement. Every day, James Harden is on this roster where they're not sure he is going to be on the roster in the regular season. He is potentially wasting hours and time of his day building an offense or building a system that will be thrown out the door the second training camp starts. So from a Nick Nurse perspective, like, we can sit here and say, yes, hold on to James Harden until you get the best deal. And Daryl Morey can feel that's the best leverage play. But from a team building perspective and from making Nick Nurse be the best version of himself as a coach and the best version of the team, it's kind of handcuffing him, because you're right. He has to have two different plans right now, but one of those plans is not going to be used. So he is wasting his time, however much of the day it is, of working on a plan with James Harden that might not be used.
So I'm going to offer a counterpoint that will bore some of our listeners, but Eliot, as a soccer guy, you'll appreciate.
I have a soccer reference for you later, so I'm excited you brought that up.
All right, great. So, I think it's probably overrated that Nick Nurse, as a coach, generally needs like all this prep time for, well, this is how we're going to play, and we got to make these big changes. So I root for Liverpool, as you know, as some of the listeners know. Wow.
Well. Glory chaser, top 6 Kyle over here.
Listen, buddy, I actually went over there as a teenager when they were not all that good, so I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, well, my team's in the championship right now, so I have no room to talk.
That's tough. So anyway, Jurgen Klopp, who manages Liverpool, coming into last season, they wanted to make a formation shift. They wanted to play 4-2-3-1 rather than a 4-3-3. And so for people who don't really follow the sport, essentially they wanted to add another defensive midfielder and then play more guys in a kind of a diamond or like a inverted triangle up front. And the logic behind it was, well, we have two guys who can control the midfield back there, and we have to accommodate all these people coming in. And this is with a roster that was essentially static. They didn't really add anyone that summer. And so it was, hey, we have the whole offseason plan for this, all of training camp or preseason for them to work on it, early part of the season, all that. And then they took the field and it didn't fucking work. And they weren't very good. And they had to abandon it. And they did something different on the fly, which is to say, Nick Nurse might have an overarching plan for this team, whether Harden is here, whether Harden's not here, whether it's what he really planned for or like a plan B. And they could take the floor and it might suck and not work, and they're going to have to adjust it regardless. And the point of hiring someone like Nurse is not for him to spend all offseason working on one grand plan and like, hey, that's it. That's all he needs to focus on. Yes, it would probably be easier for him if he's just focusing on one plan A and they come in and they drill it and it's just, this is how they play. This is what we do if you're Nick Nurse. But like, that's not how coaching generally works, especially in the NBA where it's an 82 game season. You play so many different teams, back to backs, 3 games in 4 nights where you're adjusting lineups, you're adjusting this, you're adjusting that. The general structure of the team, I think the setup of it is probably overrated. Like to say, oh, we're going to be a heavy pick and roll team is a pretty easy decision. Now, what are the wrinkles inside of that? That you can't really know until you're in these practices and you see, oh, these two guys work really well together. Or you're in the preseason and maybe a guy, could be Jaden Springer, who we're going to get to at some point. Maybe he made a big leap over the offseason and you see, oh, he can actually do this a little bit more this year. Or maybe someone didn't progress as much as you'd like. So an example of that, and this is specific to Nick Nurse, I think a lot of people in Toronto after Scotty Barnes' rookie year were expecting him to make a big leap forward. And the word out of there, and I can say this definitively, this is not coming from Nick Nurse. It's not like this was given to me by him. This is just out there in NBA circles. People in the Raptors organization were fucking pissed because Scottie essentially didn't work on his game between his first and second season. And not only was not improving, but I would argue worse in his second year than his first year. And so those type of things you can't really plan for either. You say, well, you just want everyone to be on this constant upward trajectory. Well, that's not how that works either. And so that's another thing that you can't really plan for. You can hope for it and you can want it. But all of this is to say, yeah, of course, if you just had, that's why the Nuggets, like everyone's talking up continuity, and they can just keep building and building. And then they bring in a couple new additions and they sort of know who they are and what their main stuff is. Yes, that's great. But I do think for the average team, for most teams, for a team that needs to make the leap from pseudo contender to real contender, you got to figure this stuff out over the course of the season. So I don't think this has too dramatic of an impact on, Nick Nurse's job.
So I agree, and your point is correct. And also, Doc's going to catch another shrapnel here, another stray. Like Doc's weakness was, and you listen to his former players say it, he was not good at adjustments. Like adjustments on the fly, that was not him. He had his plan. If it worked, it worked. If it didn't,
and he's very good at setting that plan.
100%. Yes, and he's won a lot of games. And again, I am pro Doc. We are a pro Doc pod for the most part. But so while I agree with you that the really important games, like where Nick Nurse is going to earn his money, will be the second round of the playoffs. Like that is where by then he has to have something in place where they're going to win 4 of those 7 games. So while I think they have all year to do that, I still think there is an extreme benefit for Nick Nurse to know if James Harden is going to be on his roster or not. I do. Like, so while you're right that come training camp, they'll figure it out and you can figure it, whatever. I think there is a balance between Morey saying, no, I'm going to wait and get the best deal. And it probably is still the best path, because if he waits and gets the best deal, then the players coming back will help Nick Nurse as well. If he just gets rid of James Harden and gets nothing of value back, well, then, I mean, Nurse could have all the time to plan if he wants. If he doesn't have the right players, that's not going to matter. So I still think holding on to him is correct. But when Nick Nurse hints at roster changes and all this and that, like it does impact his offseason planning to an extent. So it's an interesting wrinkle I feel like we haven't really talked about with this. But the other part of that, to flip it to Harden, like there's so many conflicting reports coming out about this. I think it was Dave McMenamin said the Sixers are kind of planning
I don't even know if it's conflicting. It's just there's so many reports, period.
Yes, it's a good way to phrase it.
It's like a different flavor of the same report over and over again.
What I always think about is like, I'm so in the weeds on this. I'm like, every report I see, I analyze every single word, blah, blah, blah. So for me, like the wording of one report like is so impactful compared to the wording of another report. I wonder from a casual perspective if it's still just like, yeah, he wants to go to the Clippers. Like, and that's it. So there's been a lot, like the Dave McMenamin report, Ramona Shelburne, I believe, said that James Harden still wants to be in LA. Sam Amick, I believe it is, came out and said that he definitively still wants to be in LA. I mean, as someone that also, you're covering the team closely, sees these reports every day back and forth, like what's your thoughts on the Harden roller coaster of reports?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to make clear that all those reporters that you named are all well sourced and talk to lots of people. So if I say anything to the effect of I'm tired of all the reports, it's not disparaging them. It's just the nature of the news cycle that we live in. But
yeah,
it is one of those situations where it's like there's not really anything meaningful that's happening or that is an update. I think being in Vegas for Summer League, a lot of these people they're around more front office people, team personnel for a longer period of time than they are for, I'd say, like most of the calendar year, because they're all in the same place for essentially like a full week and a half. And you're surrounded by so many teams and so many people. So of course,
like combine. It's like the
And you
NFL
can,
Combine. Yeah.
yeah, it's like any big event that just brings league personnel together for any sport. The draft, summer league, the combine, all kinds of stuff like that. So I'm not surprised that a lot of reporting is coming out, but I think it's instructive that they're all sort of saying the same thing. The phrasing's different, obviously, and these people talk to different people. Like I think Sam Amick has seemed to be particularly plugged into the Harden side of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was one of the early people who, when this first came out that James kind of wanted out, I think he was one of the first people to get to the subject of, well, why does he want out? What's his problem with the
Yep.
Sixers specifically? And you could tell that he was informed in part by, people around Harden. And that's important context compared to, here's what the trade market is. It's all valuable for different reasons. But still, at the end of the day, the facts here are, I wouldn't say the same, but they're similar to when we've talked about it pre-draft, or I'd say around the draft, around the start of free agency, in that they say that he could come back. They're still working on potential trades with him. Market is not super robust, or at least they're not getting the offers that it would require for them to make moves. And people interpret that differently, right? There'll be some people who get on podcasts or write articles or go on TV, what have you, and say, well, unreasonable price. And the same or different person gets the same information and just says, Daryl's setting a high price and is not going to trade James for anything. So all this is essentially a media literacy conversation, which is just
Yes.
a really boring thing for most people to think about. End of the day, brass tacks, nothing is really changing. The Sixers like James Harden as a player, would be happy to bring him back, would be happy to trade him if they get a return that they feel makes the team either as good as they are right now, ideally better, and help set them up for the long term. That's about it.
Well, what's funny when you phrase that James Harden thing, and I think you're right to phrase it that way. Like the Sixers like James Harden, they would trade him if they get a deal that they like. You could apply that to every single player on the
Like the
roster.
whole league.
In every single player in every sport. Like the Eagles are not going to trade Jalen Hurts. But if some team calls and offers 8 first-round picks and Justin Herbert, like, yeah, they're going to consider it. So I do think you're right that the Sixers stance on this has not changed. But my kind of read on this, and tell me if this is too tinfoil hat, like spending too much time on Twitter. I'll piggyback off what I said in the last pod. I think this thing with James Harden has been a disaster for him. The Houston thing ended up being a somewhat embarrassing thing the way it played out. There is not that market for him. I don't know if his agent's doing a poor job. I don't know what's happening, but it feels like this is not being managed well by James Harden. I believe the idea, and I think the Sixers do want him back, but I really think it benefits James Harden for the perception out there to be the Sixers really want him back. And they want, like, they're trying to convince him, and they're at the white party trying to convince him to come back. And Joel says what he says. I think that really benefits James. So I wonder how much of the Sixers really want him, they're going to do everything to keep him type of thing, is the agent saying, trying to make it seem like James Harden has a lot of teams interested in him, as opposed to what the reality is that the Clippers would trade for James Harden if it's like a package where they don't give up a ton. And the Sixers will keep Harden unless they get an offer they really like. But in reality, I think the Sixers aren't like dying to get James Harden back. I don't think the Clippers are dying to get James Harden. And he's trying to create this market or this perception that a lot of people want James. I just don't know if that's the truth. I think the reality is James will be back with the Sixers because he's under contract and he's opted in on what is essentially a team-friendly deal at this point. Or if the Clippers blow him away, they'll trade him. But that's where I think it's at. I don't think this is two teams desperately wanting James. I think both teams are kind of lukewarm on it.
I would say I don't agree that anything is pushing up the perception of James right now, because he is who he is. We've talked about this 1,000 times, where the whole thing, the game right now is really the Sixers just saying to Harden and to other teams, well, we don't care about James quitting on 2 previous teams, and we don't think he'll do that here because he doesn't have the leverage to do so this time. And I think that's probably correct, because I think if James Harden comes into training camp and is pitching a fit and not, like, or doesn't show up, or he's being disruptive, he's out of shape, whatever, pick a reason that he would screw up training camp and preseason for them. That will materially impact his future, because then it turns into another example of, look at this fucking guy who's never won anything, who chokes in the playoffs, isn't serious about the situation that he's in. And the second that everything isn't catered exactly to his liking, is just going to stomp his feet, take his ball, and go home. And that's not a guy who's going to get paid any kind of serious money next offseason. Now, I think all parties to this point, to my knowledge, have done a good job of essentially saying they're working together on potential trades. It's been an open dialogue with Harden, and there has not been pushback. Like, one thing I think it's important in these reports, with all the suggestions that Harden maybe is a little more likely to come back now, I don't think you've heard anything from Harden's camp to say he's going to be like that disruptive asshole presence if he's back here in late September. And that, to me, shows you they know the stakes here. They know that he can't have that out there, because then his value will really go through the floor. And then the Sixers will be like, well, fuck it. We just rather deal with that than trade for, some poo-poo platter of like second-round picks and expiring contracts, whatever it is. Like, they'll just play the season out, and Daryl will deal with it. So, I don't know.
The roller coaster continues. That's what we know. The roller coaster will continue with this. And again, I love rumors. I love updates. I'm ready for something to happen on this. Daryl, don't make us wait until training camp for this to come to an end. So while we wait for training camp and we listen to Nick Nurse's every word, the Sixers continue to play basketball. They're out in Las Vegas. They're at Summer League. Unfortunately, I was not able to watch their most recent game. I was on.
Oh, no. Oh, you couldn't watch Summer League. Oh,
Trust me, bro. Trust me. As fun as it was saying the Eagles offense lost the Super Bowl for 4 hours on the air, I would have rather watched Turk Smith dropping 20 points and coming off the bench, potential 6-man role that maybe he'll have this year. But you did watch it, and Jaden Springer had another awesome game. Seemed my guy Turk killed it once again. They lost. Who cares? What were your thoughts on the most recent Sixers Summer League, Springer and Turk specifically?
Well, you say they lost. Who cares? I care a lot, because that guarantees they will not be in the Summer League playoffs. And that to me,
I want more Summer League, though.
That to me is like having a second birthday in the middle of the summer. Just like,
it's like extra vacation for you.
Well, it's not even vacation, because they still have to play another game. But I know, or at least I think they have to play another game.
Yeah, they play today, I think.
Well, they do play today, but I think they might have to play Sunday. The league is weird with they just won't be in the tournament, which means they can't go to the final and play.
That is weird.
A 6th game. Yeah, it's really stupid. But anyway, so I was happy about that. I'm happy about them losing. I don't root for wins and losses. In this case, I do. 2 things. One, Terquavion Smith getting a technical foul for talking shit in the middle of a heater in a Summer League game is maybe the most on-brand thing of the summer for him. So that was great.
Wow. Thank God I couldn't tweet while this was happening. I would have made some outrageous predictions. That is like an all-time, I'm excited to hear that happen moment.
So that was great. And then, look, I think yesterday, so we're recording this on Friday morning. Thursday was the first time that I thought, oh, Jaden Springer looks too good for this format.
Wow.
Like,
that's good. That's certainly a change from the beginning of Summer League.
He was the best player on the floor for basically the entire game, scores 29 points. There were some people when I praised him in my article who were like, well, he wasn't very good down the stretch and picked up his dribble and passed a few times he shouldn't have. And I agree with that. But the thing is, he's not going to be the point guard ever on this team. He's going to be somebody who's a secondary ball handler, who's going to take open threes, attack closeouts, defend, play in transition. And I think the more time he's got in the summer, the better and better he's looked. And it would look, I'm not sitting here saying, yeah, that guy's definitely going to be a rotation guy. I'm still lower on him than the fan base, I think. But seeing him start to hit some shots toward the end of Summer League, great sign. He continues to do the things where his drives to the basket, I still have my concerns with him as a finisher inside, but his strength is a real legitimate asset on drives, and he's picking up foul after foul after foul, like constantly getting 8 to 10 free throws a game
Mhm.
in Summer League, which is a really good sign for a kid who he still has not even turned 21 yet. I think that's really important for us to think about that he is younger than some of the guys they
Which is
added
wild.
as two-way guys. And
I feel like he's
and
about to turn 21 for, like, the 3rd straight pod. Like, the
yeah,
birthday has to be coming up at some point.
it's this, I believe it's the 17th. So it's
Alright,
in
so 3 more days.
three days. But his full third season, he will be 21 years old for. So we talked a ton about, obviously Maxey, far superior player and prospect to him. But a lot of the reason people are so excited about him is, oh wow,
Mhm.
he's doing XYZ at this age. And so for Springer to be showing real growth and he's still only turning 21, that I think is a great, great sign that
So I think the
they still
question with
have
Spr
some runway with him.
Yeah, and the youth point is an outstanding one with him. When I did not watch him yesterday, but the times I have watched him, I don't come away thinking he's going to be like a top 8 player, 9 player on a legit title team. But my question for you is, as he does improve and he does look like the best player on the floor, I think the Sixers have to decide, maybe not decide, but like, how do you view Springer? Is this someone that they should like view as a contributing player this year because they are a win now team? I know we talk a lot about windows and wanting to think about the next one while keeping this one open. Or is Springer just an asset at this point? Like if he's killing it in summer league and dropping 29 points and looking like the best player on the floor, like do they capitalize on a time where there's so much trade up in the air with Levine and the Harden thing, and of course Dame and all that? Like, do you think Springer, in your eyes, is a player they can count on, or a player they should be excited about, or an asset, or is he some combination of both?
I was going to say, I don't think he's really either at this point. I think the summer league stuff is all well and good. He's not going to have real value beyond, oh, he's a like a throw-in guy, and maybe you
Mhm.
could sell some team on his upside, unless he proves it in the NBA, right? Like there have been a lot of guys who have good runs in summer league and then stink it up against real competition. So he's got to prove that to some extent. He did look good at the end of the regular season in meaningless games last year, was the G League Finals MVP. All
Love it.
these are all, look, none of these things are that important, but they're better than him not having
Yeah.
good games in the NBA. It's better than not being the G League Finals MVP. Better than him looking like shit to start summer league
Hmm.
in some respects. So all these things are positive signposts. The thing is going to be, when he's a regular NBA rotation player, can he make an impact on the floor? That's all that matters, because until then, he's just a lottery ticket, both to the Sixers and to a team acquiring him. If he puts together maybe like a month of solid basketball, that changes a lot of things. You can go to a team and say, look, this is a real value add
Yeah.
in this trade package. We don't have to give up, this pick, this other guy. We're drawing the line because we're offering you Jaden Springer. That's the type of approach they can take if he's able to show consistent NBA results. Now, can he get there? I don't know, because I still don't necessarily trust the jumper. I think he's had a couple of good games, but it's easy to get caught up in that and ignore, he shot pretty poorly to open the summer league.
Yeah.
So it's going to be all about how consistent can he be with the jumper. Because once teams have to respect him, I think everything else that he can do is so much easier to do for him. Like he's not going to have to labor as hard when he's got to try to drive through guys who are already sagging off of him. And he's that, we talked about the 2-footed leaping thing.
Hmm.
If they can sit back and just wait for him at the rim, essentially, he's screwed. He's not going to be able to finish or draw fouls at a rate that will help him be an NBA player. But if he can bring that guy out to him where he can just go buy a closeout. That's the difference between him being a real NBA player and a guy who's probably a quad A guy who's too good for the G League, but not good enough for an NBA rotation.
Well, went 2 for 5 from 3 last game.
Yep.
So, the Sixers will take that. Turk, let's talk about him. Outside of his what sounds like the ultimate franchise swag moment, getting a tech for being amazing in
The
summer league.
smallest guy, the skinniest guy on the floor flexing at somebody through a
Love
layup
it.
is why he got a tech, by the way.
Love it. What else did you see from him? Didn't start, which I thought was interesting. I did see that. Came off the bench, still played a ton of minutes. I think he was over 20 minutes or around there. Why didn't he start, number one? And then what'd you see from him?
I think it's probably just wanting to give other guys looks that they're maybe less certain on, I would say, because Turk at this point
has
clearly
proven.
built for the summer league setting.
Yeah.
I think there is a degree of overreacting to him because guys like him look a lot better in summer league than in some other settings. Now, that being said, I think he's shown plenty of on-ball juice. I think off-ball, he's obviously, like, as a catch-and-shoot guy, the range that he has, the clean mechanics, the quick release, the confidence, all that.
The willingness, yeah.
He's going to be fine even if he doesn't shoot well right away, he's somebody that you keep as a long-term bet, that as an Isaiah Joe type guy, that eventually that guy is going to shoot. And, maybe they wouldn't even have him on a two-way if it wasn't for Isaiah Joe being cut last year. That'd probably be a different story. But the thing I don't get are all the people who are like, they need to guarantee him a roster spot. Do people understand he's already on a two-way contract, right?
Yeah, so explain that to me, because I don't fully understand it. So I think of it a little bit almost like in a practice squad NFL way, where the Eagles can have somebody on a practice squad, they're on the roster, they own their rights, but another team can sign that player away. Are you saying, and you can just explain it, like no one can take Turk from the Sixers?
Not at the moment, no. I mean,
but when he's on a two-way, I'm saying.
Yes, he's signed to a two-way contract. If he was just strictly like a G League guy, it'd be different. But you can actually trade two-way contracts in trades. It doesn't really happen.
So what's the difference between him being a two-way guy and just having a roster spot outside of probably financial security?
Well, yeah, I was going to say there's guaranteed money involved with the salary cap and things of that nature. So two-way contracts exist essentially to give more opportunities to up-and-coming players. It was partially, I don't remember if it was pre-COVID that it was implemented, but two-way deals were expanded as a result of COVID. They allow guys to be on the roster or on the NBA roster for longer. They had more days that they could use.
Yeah.
Now, this is another annoying new CBA thing that I am blanking on the exact terms right now, but they changed how the days are applied or how many days you can use. I believe it used to be, so I'm making up the numbers here, but it used to be something like you sign a guy to a two-way contract. He has, let's call it 60 days he can be with the NBA team. Now, this is not he plays in 60 games. This is if he was at a practice on a Tuesday in January.
That counts.
That is one of his 60 days. If he's with the NBA team in an official capacity for that day, that's one of his days. And that's how you sort. Once you run up the 60 days, you either have to sign that guy to a standard NBA contract or they can only be used in the G League. And so that would be the difference. If you really think that Terquavion Smith is going to be a regular rotation guy, essentially right away, you want to try to get him lined up on a contract sooner than later, because then you're not worrying about his limitation with days and that sort of thing. But that's also a problem that's not going to really matter until the middle of the regular season.
Yeah.
So then you could argue the only reason to lock him into an NBA guaranteed contract, and more likely like a guaranteed year and then some non-guaranteed years after that, is that you think he's going to be so good that his play whenever he's with the big club is going to cause somebody to offer him a real deal next offseason that will be more expensive than what you could get him for at like this very moment. To me, that's not that compelling, because I think if Turk comes out and plays in preseason and shoots the lights out and then plays well in like mid-October or early November, the Sixers could then say, yeah, we're just going to sign him to a real deal. They could do what they did last season, leave a roster spot open for flexibility or whatever, and then convert him to a standard deal. I think that's easy enough. So I don't think they need to rush to get him off of a two-way contract. Just
Yeah. So I'm like a huge Turk guy. To me, and that's all good information, this seems like worrying about nothing. Like they have
yeah,
tons of options with this guy. They have the full 60 days. They can add him at whatever point. Like if Turk is good and it can help the NBA roster, he will be on there eventually. I'm even okay waiting the 60 days and doing it on day 59. Like there's no reason to rush this. But that is good information. So I teased a soccer question, and this is where it comes in. I thought of this yesterday or a few days ago, and I think it's a brilliant idea, and I'm curious if you like it. So Turk, I think he's somebody that, because of where he is at right now with the Sixers, he's not going to get a ton of minutes this season. Even if he's impressive, even if all these things, he's maxing out at 8, 9, 10 minutes a game. And that's probably a best case scenario for him. I remember when the Sixers were in the process, Sam Hinkie talked about the most valuable thing for a young player that is the hardest to get for them is minutes. And that was the benefit of what the Sixers did. They played a lot of players that wouldn't play on other teams, a lot of minutes, and guys developed. Covington, Grant, like those guys got a ton of minutes that they wouldn't have otherwise. And because of that, they were better players later on. Didn't benefit the Sixers, but better players later on. So you're a soccer fan. I'm a soccer fan. For those listening, what soccer does is they do a loan system where if, let's say, I'll use the Sixers here. The Sixers have Turk Smith. What they do in soccer is you can loan him out to another team. He plays for that team. He wears their jersey. He gets minutes with them, but the team still owns their right, and then he can come back in a year. Why wouldn't the NBA do this? Like, why? Like, do you think a loan system in like they do in soccer would work in the NBA, where Turk Smith, he goes and plays for, pick whatever terrible team you want to pick, Charlotte, like one of those teams that is not going to be competitive, but they get a better player. They get somebody that will make them, in theory, more competitive. Turk is maybe not the best example because you don't know what he's going to be. The Sixers get a ton of minutes for Turk. Charlotte gets a player they don't have otherwise that might help them be more competitive. And then in a year, or whatever the term of the loan is, the Sixers can take him back if they want. They get a more developed player. They get a player that's played a lot. It really does work in soccer, like you see it. Now, a lot of times guys stay with that team, and that would have to be figured out. But do you think a loan system like they use in soccer would be beneficial and work in the NBA?
it could. I think the argument would be that they would rather just put a guy on their G League team and have them
But that's not the same type of
develop there.
competition.
It's not the same type of competition, but also they're playing a lot more than they would for, in Turk's case, if he goes to Charlotte, there's no guarantee he plays at all. And that's one of the pitfalls of the loan system in, EPL, La Liga, etc., is that you can send a guy to a place with the idea in mind, like, oh yeah, he's going to develop here. And oftentimes that doesn't actually happen, because once he's out of your immediate purview, it's out of your hands at that point.
Right. You can't control
go to the manager of the team and say, what the fuck, man, you got to play this guy more. Once the terms are signed and they say, yeah, we'll pay his salary for the season, they get to decide whatever they want to do with him. They also, the other side of it is there are injury things that can pop up from that. Like some teams will run guys into the ground knowing, hey, that guy's on loan. We don't care if he has to play 40 minutes a game, or in soccer, it'd be like plays the full 90 for 30 straight games or whatever, rather than just, we're going to be a little restrained with this guy. And, he's got a little injury issue. We're going to hold him back. We're not going to subject him to a strenuous workload. So the incentives are weird there too, where they just want to get the best they can get out of him for that season rather than what's best for him in the long term. And then the other part of that, sort of connected to that, is that maybe they want him to play a different role than he's playing in, or for the Sixers, we would say
Right.
in this example. Like maybe he goes, let's say Turk goes to the Charlotte Hornets, as you mentioned, a team like that. And you say, well, he's going to be more of a point guard here rather than an off guard. Well, then maybe he could develop things that he needs to for the Sixers, but then he's could stagnate as an off-ball guy with movement and the type of things they need him to do. Might not be working on the right things. He could be developing bad habits on a younger team. Like, it's the problem with it, with implementing it in the NBA, is that there's no inherent structure to this, and teams are not designed in this way to be like loan friendly teams.
Right.
It, over the long term, I think you could make it work, because there would be teams that fashion themselves as, we're a development type team, and we're a team that will take chances on loan guys and cast offs and what have you. And there are clubs like I think Dortmund is probably the best example of a team that buys players early when they're 15, 16, 17.
Yeah, and then flips
And
them.
they give them tons of time, and that's the trade-off. They then sell those guys for, tens of millions of pounds or euros, or however you want to just say dollars, since this is a two American guys talking podcast. And over time, you could create more infrastructure like that, where, yeah, we know we're sending this guy to like the version of the Spurs that's just not trying to compete for a title. But I also don't think American sports teams are wired in a way where they say, we're just going to be a developmental club. We don't care or don't have aspirations to compete for a title. I don't think you can sell that to the fan bases, regardless of where you are. And that makes it tougher too.
And I think too, like, what you see in soccer is a team in the top division will loan a player to a team in a lower division, where that team then benefits from having a player they wouldn't have otherwise. It helps them win, potentially helps them get promoted. And so they have incentive to play him. Now, to your point, minutes, injuries, those are all things they have to think of. I'd be curious to see how fans would react to it. Like, American fans aren't built like this. They're not conditioned to it. It's how things work overseas. Like, imagine a world where the Sixers lend Turk to the Celtics, just as an example. And then in the playoffs, now I know you can't play against your lone team, whatever, but let's just say Turk then, drops 12 points off the bench and the Celtics beat the Sixers. Like, I also wonder how fans would react to this idea of a player they like, a player they want to watch develop, like, then playing well against them or rooting for them. And a lot of times people want to stay with where they got loaned. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how American fans would react to it.
The other thing related to that I was actually thinking about this week, why do soccer teams in Europe, but I guess just everywhere outside of America, frame someone's salary as per week rather than a year?
Dude, they call them wages, which is also interesting. But like, I think it's so weird. Like, in America, it'll be Harden makes $36 million a year. In overseas, like in the EPL, and I'm assuming they do this in La Liga and League One and all that. Like, yeah, it's like he makes $800,000 a week. I have no idea why. Like, do they get
so here
weekly there?
let's do this. Let's do this right now. We'll do the conversion. So
God, I hope this isn't math. Like, how much, like, figuring out per week over.
Tobias Harris this season is making $39,270,150. That's his
I was going to put this in a
salary
calculator, but that was too specific.
No, all you got to do is divide it by 52 weeks.
Right.
So that means he will make roughly $755,000 a week. Which is like, it's almost more absurd when you put it in those terms. Now, again, that's pre-tax and all that. So that's not the actual.
Well, what do you think would piss fans off more? Phrasing it like that or phrasing it how we phrase it now? Because people also do the thing where it's like, James Harden makes X amount of dollars every second he's on the court or whatever it is. Like, they do that to prove a point. What would piss fans off more? Hearing Tobias makes $700,000 a week, or hearing he makes whatever it is per year?
That's a good question. Oh, actually,
I think the per week thing would feel like an extra little stab, like an extra little twist.
Do you want to know how much Nikola Jokic makes a week?
Oh my God, no. He probably calls it wages too, but go ahead.
He makes over $1 million a week.
Well, did you see he got the SB NBA Player of the Year?
Yeah, he deserved it. What do you like?
I
You're
guess.
still on this anti-Jokic
I guess.
crusade,
I'm
man.
fine with him getting it. I'm fine with him getting it in that instance
You're dead
because
along with the dinosaurs, man.
yeah, I'm holding out on that. Here's the thing about a take. Eventually it's always right. I just got to hold on until next year when he gets bounced in the second round and I can take the victory lap. So, anyway, I think a loan system would be kind of interesting and cool. Like it would also mean, hey, I'm watching a Charlotte game on a Tuesday because I want to see how Turk's doing. Like I think there would be some cross population in terms of growing, growing the audience for.
You're not getting me to watch the Hornets for Turk Smith. I'll tell you that.
I'll get a Charlotte Turk jersey if I have to at that point. But all right, the last thing we had written down, the flopping rule. We can wrap it up with this. So the NBA put out that they're going to essentially, I forget the exact penalty, but like if you're called for a flop, I think it's maybe a technical and a free throw or something like that. What do you think of the rule? And if Harden's back, like how's this going to impact his game? And I don't think Joel flops at all, but
oh, come on.
I don't, man. I don't I don't think he does it
okay.
any more than any other player. Like I don't think Joel is a flopper, in my opinion. Does he foul hunt? Yes, but I don't think he flops in the traditional sense that people hate flopping.
Come on, man. You're
Dude,
just
how
being
about, like, let's be real.
dishonest,
Like,
man.
does he foul hunt? Yes, he fouls hunt. But I don't think he's not the Marcus Smart. There's no like super egregious clips out there that I can think of where he's like throwing his head back and doing all that.
Eliot, you can't be serious right now.
If you want to send me one, I will change
I
my
love Joel. I think he's a super talented player. The idea that he doesn't flop is just preposterous.
But do you see what I'm saying? I think he foul hunts for sure. Like he does the arm lifting and all that. I don't think that's what the NBA is trying to get rid of. I think they're trying to get rid of the egregious overacting on like charges and those type of things.
I hope the people listening to the podcast later and not seeing this live stream.
I was going to say the look on your face is why you have
the
to
look that I have given Eliot like 4 times here. Of course he flops. Of course he flops. That's not even debatable.
But do you see the difference in what I'm saying between foul hunting and flopping?
There is a difference, but I'm saying that.
But which would you qualify him more as?
He does both.
I don't know, man. Like I don't think they made the flopping rule with Joel in mind, is the point I'm making.
Maybe not just him, but he's certainly one of the guys high up the list, I would say. I don't know.
All right, what do you think? How's it going to impact?
Well, there are 2 different conversations here. Does Joel get fouled a lot? Yes. Does he sell the contact well? Yes. He also flops on top of that. That's not really debatable.
Well, I remember when the Sixers played the Nets in the playoffs. I went on that Nets pod, and they were ripping Joel as a hardcore flopper. So maybe I am wrong about this. I can't think of many instances of Joel like throwing his head back or doing anything like that.
So here's what I would say. I think it'll impact Joel and James and the team the same way that every new rule change does. The first 2 months, and I'm including myself in this, there will be articles written, people on TV, people on podcasts talking about, oh man, this is like really what a dramatic change. They're calling this way more. This is really bad for Joel and James and Marcus Smart, and you can just go down the list of players. And then in December, nobody's going to fucking care because they're going to stop calling it. And it's going to be the same way they've officiated NBA games for decades. And they're not going to do it in the playoffs. Like, in theory, I would love for rules like this to be enforced. I actually think one of the best things that soccer did, again, and we are not a soccer podcast, but really
we might be an off-season soccer pod.
Yeah. One of the best things they did on paper was saying a dive is a yellow card. Mm-hmm. They never fucking enforce it. Never. Guys dive in every single game. And I could probably count on less than my 2 hands the amount of times I've seen a diving card given out in a game I've watched. And I've watched hundreds of games since they've implemented that rule.
Flex.
And they never, ever, ever call it.
Yeah.
And I just don't. It's one of those things where, because it's a tech and because you only get 2 of those, I think officials, and to some degree rightfully so, are going to say that's too steep of a punishment to give a guy who, well, maybe, and I don't know if this is exactly how it works, but if it is like a standard tech rather than like a defensive 3 seconds type attack. I don't think they want to give them to guys and put them at risk of an ejection for a flop, essentially. I don't think that's how referees will look at it. So
Well,
I tend to think it's good on paper, but it won't be used in practice.
So I agree with you for the most part on that. Where I would disagree is I think where people complain the most about the flopping is in the playoffs because the most people are watching, everyone's reacting to the game, like everyone's on Twitter or Thread or whatever. And that's where the moments where I think the NBA might want it implemented because they're going to want to see or show people that this is being punished. So I agree that in general, that's how it goes with rules. Like first 2 months, they're calling it all the time, and then it fades off. I do wonder if in the biggest games this year, maybe you will see more flops. You won't see it from Joel because he doesn't flop, but I wonder if you'll see it from other people. Shaking your head.
We really need to end the pod on that.
Well,
That's
producer James put something in the chat saying he's going to put up a poll for later. Joel's not going to win that poll because Joel's not winning any polls right now. People hate him, but I'll continue to try to defend the guy, I guess. So until next time, sometime next week, we will maybe have some more soccer references. Maybe we'll, who knows what we'll do on the next pod, but we will be back next week. Thank you guys, everyone that's listening. I always say at the end, and I should say at the beginning, but thank you so much to everybody that's listening, especially in season, but off season too. If you're still riding with us, if you're still with us 56 minutes into this, you are a true one. I love you for it. And thank you guys to everyone that's become listeners of the pod. So Kyle, until next time, man, I'll talk to you later.
Try not to flop, everybody.
Oh my God.